Genesis chapter 20. One of those crazy passages, and I don't know if you've ever done anything that you really felt like, man, that was a stupid thing to do. And then you thought, you'd never do it again. And then maybe you became a Christian even after that. And you started following the Lord. And then the next thing you know, there you are doing it again. Anybody? You don't have to raise your hand. But isn't that amazing? How many of you guys thought that when you got saved, you were never going to sin again? You just thought it was like, okay, now I'm just going to be perfect from now on. Anybody? You guys are pretty, you didn't think that? But in a sense, as we look at the book of Genesis, it's almost like when you go back to Egypt. It's like you go back to that place where you should have never been before. And we'll see that with the children of Israel as they wander through the wilderness. They get out of Egypt, which is a type of the world, a type of sin, a type of just, following their own direction and the bondage of slavery that sin brings in our lives. But then when they get out into the wilderness and God has set them free and they're wandering around in the wilderness, where do they want to go? Back down to Egypt. And we saw that actually the very first pattern of that was in Genesis chapter 12 when Abraham was thinking about, the drought and the famine that was in the land and everything that, was coming against him. And he's there, we talked about between Bethel, which is the house of God, and he's between Ai, which is the dump, the heap. And he is kind of stuck between the heap and kind of stuck between the house of God and the world. And he decides, hey, I'm going to die in this famine. I better go back down to Egypt. And so he heads back down to Egypt. Now, after that, he gets back from Egypt. And, of course, we remember the problem that he brought back with him from Egypt. Remember what that problem was, anybody? Beautiful young woman named Hagar. Remember? Hagar the handmaiden, who was an Egyptian handmaiden. Remember, he came out of Egypt with male servants and female servants and donkeys and herds and all that stuff. And so he came out with Hagar. I remember the whole debacle with that. God told Abraham he was going to be the father of many nations, that his offspring could not be numbered for the multitude that they were. And you remember that Hagar was their fulfillment to that. Remember, Sarah said, obviously I'm not going to have any children. She's in her 70s or 80s, probably 85, I think, actually, around that time. Or I don't know how old she was. But anyway, she's old, definitely old. And she says, take my handmaiden Hagar and have a child with her. So Abraham takes it, okay. And he does, has this child with her handmaiden. And then God comes to Abraham again and he says, you're going to bear a son. And he's like, the Ishmael might live before you. Just, use Ishmael, right? And God's like, no. From Sarah's womb, from her womb, you're going to bear a son. And so remember, God made that promise to Abraham, and then he made that promise to them with Sarah there, so that God would establish that that's what he was going to do. And of course, remember, Sarah laughed. She laughed at that because, hey, I'm an old woman. Am I going to have pleasure in my old age? Remember, and God said, why did you laugh? And Sarah said, I didn't laugh. And he says, oh, but you did. And of course, that would be their son's name, would be Laughter, or Isaac. And so all that's happened. Now remember, right after that promise, what happened next was that God went to the edge of the hill where Abraham was sojourning. And the two men that were with the Lord, they looked over the hill and they continued on towards Sodom. And God said, should I hold back from Abraham the things that I'm about to do? And of course, Abraham kind of catches the drift that God is going to bring judgment upon the city of Sodom and Gomorrah. And he negotiates with God and he says, hey, he gets all the way down, starts out at like 50 righteous. There's 50 righteous in the city. Would you destroy the whole city? And he said, no, if there's 50 righteous, I won't. Abraham, excuse the phrase, he Jews God. Right? He's the father of the Jews. So he can do that. He gets God all the way down to 10. If there's 10 righteous in the city, and God says, if there's 10 righteous in the city, I won't destroy the city. And of course, you know the story. Remember, down in Sodom and Gomorrah, the angels go, and the only ones that they can find in all of Sodom and Gomorrah that are righteous are Lot. And possibly his family, probably not. Not after we see what happened. And so you can imagine from Abraham's perspective, as he's sitting up on the hill, he's thinking, I just interceded for that city. I just saved that city. They owe me their lives. Thinking there has to be, Lot is there. His family is there. My nieces are there. People are there in the city. No doubt that city's going to survive. And then the next scene shows a big plume, big flash, and a big, mushroom cloud. And Abraham's just probably in disbelief of the fire and brimstone that rains down upon the city, and nothing is left. And no doubt he didn't see his nephew Lot make his way to the other city, who then, when he saw the other city, and his wife turned to a pillar of salt and his daughters were with him, he probably didn't see Lot run off into the mountains. And it kind of gives you this impression that Lot and his daughters think that they're the only ones in the world that are left. Like God just judged the entire world and we are all that's left, just us three. And so they do something really immoral, just sleep with their father to try to continue his offspring. And just awful situation. But that's kind of where we left everything, as we see Abraham leave now Beersheba, where he was sojourning, this place of, just in the land where God had promised him, and he leaves that area. And we don't know why he left that area. God didn't tell him to leave that area. Nothing is indicated as to why he did it, but we kind of suspect that Abraham probably feels a little let down by God. Because didn't he negotiate for the city, and now God destroys it anyway? What is God going to do to me? I mean, it's kind of a confusing time. Have you guys ever been confused as to why God was allowing what he was allowing in your life? All of a sudden you thought everything was wonderful. And it's amazing, because I get to see this all the time. I get to see families who are doing great. Everything's beautiful. And then something happens in their life, whether it's financial or with their health or a death in their family, and everything all of a sudden has gone sideways. And they're just kind of like, what is going on? Or how could God allow this? Or why is this happening to me? And it's just this big confusing thing. But the thing that we can always remember, no matter how crazy things get in life, is that God is in control. He is in control. And as much as things go sideways for a while or a time or a season, he has a plan for your life. And if you will but seek him and say, okay, God, I want it your way. I want to follow you. Everything seems out of control. Everything seems sideways in my life. But I'll follow you. I'll trust you. God will work everything out. And sometimes, even when we don't do that, when we think we're just going to have to do it on our own from here on out because obviously God doesn't love me or God has forsaken me, oftentimes, even in that situation, he has given us promises that he is still going to fulfill in spite of all the drama that we think that we're facing, the impossible things. And, for Shannon and I, when we first got married, we really had those struggles in this dark time. Well, the problem with that, having difficulty in our marriage early on, was that God had promised me or told me when I was 18 years old that I was going to be a pastor. And now I'm going through all this, Shannon and I are going through financial struggles, and, we had a house fire, and we got in a car accident, and all these things were just kind of unraveling in our lives. So financially, we were going down the tubes. It put stress on our marriage. Our marriage was difficult. All these things were happening to us, and we didn't know why. And we're like, we could never be in ministry because things are so messed up. Our lives are so messed up. And then seeing God work those things out, pull us out a little bit at a time, set our feet on solid ground, teach us to trust in him, teach us to love each other. And as we fell in love with each other again, and as we started to move forward in our lives, we look back on it now and we see, how could we have ever been in ministry had we not gone through those difficulties? Had we not gone through those struggles? Because now, as we've gone through those struggles, it makes it so much easier to minister to other people who are suffering. I love what Gail Irwin said one time. He was talking about just going to counseling and things like that, and he said, he says, I've been to counseling myself. I've sought counsel many times on many different things, and he says, but I will never let somebody counsel me who has not suffered, because they will not be careful with me. And I thought that was beautiful. You need to have somebody who can give you advice about the problems you're going through and the failures that they're going through in life, by somebody who has maybe been through those failures or been through at least difficulty in their life and seen God bring them through it. Because it validifies it. Otherwise, we're just not careful with people. Come on, just trust the Lord. What's wrong with you? You just need to trust Jesus. You can't. You're just sinning in your life. That's what's wrong with you. And it's. Have you ever got counsel like that? You're like, I'm having a hard time. That's because there's sin in your life. That's because you don't trust Jesus. It's easy for somebody to say all the right words all the wrong ways, right? And not to be able to come alongside you and really counsel you through the problem. And so when we look at Abraham's life, we see a guy who failed and trusted God, and failed and trusted God. And again, we're going to see a failure. But what God is doing in this situation is He's refining Abraham. He's showing him two things. One, Abraham, you don't have to be a liar. Okay? You can knock that off. And two, even if you're a liar, I'm with you, Abraham, because I've made promises to you. I have covenants with you that I'm not going to break. And so too it is for you and for me. God has made covenants to us as Christians that He is not going to break, no matter how stupid you are or how dumb the decisions you make are. God loves you, and He will never leave you or forsake you, and that is not dependent upon your behavior. Right? And that's a hard thing for us to grapple with, isn't it? Because I think oftentimes we feel like it's just like everything else. Like if I mess up at work, they're going to fire me. Or if I, don't do good all year, then Santa Claus isn't going to bring me any gifts, right? And yet if you have a child, you know how easy it is to forgive. You know how easy it is to give presents, even though they've been the worst little jerk you've ever seen all year long. Why? Because you love them. And God does not perfect us in our bodies and in our behaviors. When God perfects the Christian, He perfects us in relationship with Him. That's what Christian perfection is. And hopefully as we walk through this life, we're better this year than we were last year. And we'll be better next year than we were this year. And God will mature us, and He'll grow us, and He'll make us more honest, and make us more loving, and make us more usable in His kingdom. But don't mistake your behavior as being what endears you to God. He is endeared to you because of His promises to you through His Son, who He allowed to die on the cross for your sins. And that is what endears you to God, because by believing in Jesus, you are now His child. And so it's not based on your behavior. And you may be punished for your behavior, and you may suffer consequences for your behavior, but that does not affect your relationship with God in the sense that you are His child and He loves you. And it does not nullify the fact that He is faithful and just to forgive us our sins when we confess our sins, right? And He cleanses us from all unrighteousness. So let's dig in. Let's look at Abraham and his bonehead mistakes. And I believe, the only way I can even understand what Abraham is doing here is just to realize that he has just watched Sodom and Gomorrah go up in smoke, and he's confused. He's confused about where he should be, where God wants him to be, and so he kind of wanders off the path. It says, and Abraham journeyed from there to the south, from Beersheba, and dwelt in between Kadesh and Shur. So he's still, not sure, right? He's like, I'm going to be in the middle again. These places. And stayed in Gerar. Now Abraham said to Sarah his wife, or said of Sarah his wife, she is my sister. And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. Okay, now there's a problem here. The problem is that Sarah is how old now? 89 or 90. She's 89 or 90. But you have to realize a couple things. One is she was a beautiful woman. And you've seen some of these women who just, maybe Hollywood ladies, never seem to age. Have you guys seen these ladies? They just never seem to age. Just like you saw them, like for instance, I'll just give you one. Sandra Bullock. How old is she? She's got to be old, but she looks the same as she did when I was a teenager, right? And it's the same as so many of these. And maybe that's natural and maybe it's not. I don't know. But Sarah was just one of those ladies that never seemed to age. She just never seemed to age. And probably something supernatural has happened to Sarah. And that may be in terms of her beauty as well, because remember, she is old. It tells us in the book of Romans that her bodies and Abraham's bodies were all but dead. They were dead, unable to bear children. And God did a supernatural restoration of her womb. Later on in chapter 21, we're going to see that she nurses her son Isaac herself, breastfeeds him, which means that something has happened physiologically, and very likely that has happened physically too. So she wakes up one day and she's like oil of Olay. I look, man, what have I been doing that makes me look so young again? It's like God restored her youth or something like that, because she's 90 years old. And Abraham, remember early in chapter 12, he said, hey, when we go down to Egypt, do me this kindness. Wherever we go, tell people you're so beautiful that they would kill me for you. So tell people that you're my sister. And she's like, okay, right. And so he's pulling this again. Now remember, last time he went down to Egypt, it was just kind of this failure in Abraham's life. And now he comes and he tells him again, and again Sarah is taken. Just crazy. And I don't know how Sarah puts up with this guy, but she did. And God protected her. And I think, Sarah's an example to wives. And not that, you should do something stupid like this and tell somebody your husband's sister so they don't, whatever. Or lie for your husband or anything like that. But what this does show us is that when a wife submits to her husband, God protects her. Right? God protects her. Even if he's dumb. And I always tell ladies this. If your husband is going to make a mistake, and I know sometimes, ladies, and you're looking at your husband and you're thinking, submission to this guy is intellectual suicide. If I were to do that, you have no idea what this man is capable of. Well, he picked you, so I guess. But what happens when your husband makes a stupid decision and the judgment of God falls upon him? Do you want to be in front of him or behind him? Right? You want to be behind him, and say, okay, you know what, I'll follow you. The beautiful thing is, and this is usually true, not always, but this is usually true, that when a woman submits to her husband and dedicates herself to, I'm going to submit to my husband. I'm not saying immoral things, I'm not saying illegal things. But I'm saying, she decides, okay, I'm going to follow you, honey. I'm going to let you lead wherever you want to go, not necessarily just where I tell you to go. But I'm going to lead. And as you lead, I'm going to be behind you 100%. Usually, and eventually, I think always, almost always. But usually the husband will do what he feels is best for you if he knows you're 100% behind him. If he doesn't feel like you're 100% behind him, but he feels like he's fighting with you, he'll usually do what he thinks is best for him because he feels like he has to compete. It's a secret, ladies. If you can learn that secret to say, okay, I'm going to follow my husband, he'll usually pick what would be better for her. That's his default. Because men feel responsible for their wives. They really do. Most men. And again, this is stereotypical. It's not in every case, but I'd say most times, when a wife will follow her husband, he'll do the right thing. He'll lead her. And just to make it fair, husbands, don't make your wives do stupid things, right? It says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her. That's what it tells us in Ephesians. And so as husbands, we have to take responsibility for our wives. And we have to say, okay, when is it a good time to make a decision that she doesn't like? When is that going to benefit both of us? Is that going to benefit the family? And when is it a good time to heed the voice of my wife and say, okay, I think you're right. Because I think that it takes two in a marriage, and it's a partnership, right? But there has to be a leader. And God has appointed you men to be the leaders of the house, right? And so you're the leader, and so where you go is going to affect your entire family. And some husbands, despite how submissive their wives are selfish. And some husbands, when their wives aren't submissive, they're still selfish. So we have to be very aware of that our wives are to be treated like Christ loves the church, to love our wives like that. And I'm convicted myself because I don't always do that, but I have a great wife. So moving on, verse 3 through 7, it says, But God gave to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, Indeed, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife. So this, I don't know, to me, this sounds a little bit more like the Godfather than God the Father. But he showed me in the middle of the night, you're a dead man. What? Anyway, but Abimelech had not come near her, and he said, Lord, will you slay a righteous nation also? Did he not say to me, she is my sister? And she even herself said, he is my brother. In the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands I have done this. Now, this guy, I am a man of integrity, right? I just take women at will, but I am an upright guy. Isn't this crazy? So he's telling God this. And God said to him in a dream, yes, I know that you did this in the integrity of your heart. Yeah, right. Yeah, I know that's what you think, maybe, is what God's saying here. For I also withdrew you from sinning against me, therefore I did not let you touch her. And so, in other words, I'm the one who pushed you away from her. If it would have been up to you, you would have done whatever you wanted to do, but I'm the one who kept you from it. That's what God's telling him. So yeah, you did it in the integrity of your heart, you think, but really it was me who kept you from her. Now therefore restore the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you shall live. But if you do not restore her, know that you shall surely die, you and all who are yours. Isn't this amazing? So Abraham leaves the place where God was speaking to him, goes into the land, what would be the land of the Philistines. Not the land that God is giving to him, but the land of the Philistines. And he's hanging out there. And God, still, even though he's lying and he's running away, God still comes to his defense. Even though he's got himself into this horrible situation. Now that should be a very, very interesting and comforting thing to us. Because oftentimes we will make the mistake of thinking, I'm a bonehead, I made these mistakes, I did this stupid thing, and therefore God isn't going to help me. God isn't going to come to my aid. I don't deserve it, right? We feel that way. And yet, is that true? Well, are you his child? And you just think about that in terms of children and parents. Do children get the aid of their parents even when they make mistakes? Yeah, undeservedly so. And God has not dealt with us according to our sins, but according to his grace and his mercy, he deals with us. As a father pities his children, so the Lord pities those who fear him, those who love him. And so as children of God, we're not in this situation where it's, you follow all the rules and I'll love you, and you break all the rules and I'll beat you and kill you and destroy you forever. We are in the situation where, maybe things are hard, maybe things are bad, and maybe we made mistakes in our lives. But ultimately God is there waiting for us to reach out to Him in those problems and say, God, I know that I deserve punishment. I know that what I did was wrong. Confession, right? But will you forgive me and help me? I know that I got myself into this financial mess, but will you help me out of it? I've seen God do that. Like, take Shannon and I, for instance, just out of this financial mess, and we felt so responsible for all of it. When we were first married. And we went through a lot of trials, but we still probably could have spent our money better, and we were kind of feeling guilty about all that. And how God just completely turned it around and provided for us and restored our good credit. And just amazing the way the Lord will do it if we will just repent and turn to Him and confess, Lord, I can't do this. I remember one time, in fact, I remember early on in our marriage, I remember praying, God, you're either going to have to give me a lot of money or just kill me, because I just can't do this. I can't figure this out. And He didn't do either. He didn't give me a lot of money, He didn't kill me, but just all of a sudden things just started to click. And God was He just gave grace. He began to help us. So interesting as God appears to Abimelech by night, and He comes to the defense of Abraham the liar. Isn't that interesting? Wasn't there a movie called that or something like that? It was Jacob the Liar. But here's Abraham the liar. And he's just telling these crazy lies. And God comes to him and He says, hey, this is my guy. You've taken his wife. I know you didn't know it was his wife, and that's why I haven't killed you yet. But I'm going to kill you. That's pretty serious, isn't it? This is pretty intense. I'm going to kill you, and I'm going to kill your whole household, God tells this guy, if you don't give this guy his wife back. Well, why? Because it would seem as Abraham runs away in fear, it's like the enemy is just taking his opportunity, using this pagan king Abimelech to break up the seed, because God has specific purpose for that woman, doesn't He? And Abimelech has nothing to do with it. And her purity and Abimelech are not to come anywhere near each other. And God has a son that He's promised to this 90-year-old woman right away. Now, I don't think that normally He would take 90-year-old women into His harem. He probably didn't realize she was that old. I heard an interesting story Joe Foch told one time, and he said that there was a harvest crusade, and a Calvary pastor decided to take his aunt, his elderly aunt. He went and picked her up at the home and took her to the harvest crusade. She was a, foul-mouthed old lady. From the time he was little, he remembers her just always being kind of a crass old woman. And she came to the harvest crusade, and Greg Laurie preached, and she went forward and gave her life to Jesus. And in the car on the way home, she says, I guess I'm going to have to quit my job. And he's like, what, you have a job? And she's like, yeah, I have a job. Me and several of the other ladies in the home have a job that is probably not a good job for being a Christian. He says, what do you do? And she says, well, you know those 900 numbers where guys call in and you talk dirty to them? She was 80 years old, and she was on the other end of the line. I don't think any guy is probably thinking that's who I'm talking to, but this is kind of the same situation. Here's this 90-year-old woman. You don't ever get what you expect you're going to get out of sin, do you? You don't really ever know what blow it's actually going to deal you. But he tells him, Abraham is my prophet. He's going to pray for you, and that's what's going to save you. What's the difference between a prophet and a priest? A priest is somebody who goes to God on behalf of the people. A prophet is somebody who goes to the people on behalf of God. And that's what Abraham was. This is the first usage of the word prophet, actually, in the Old Testament. It says, verse 8, so Abimelech rose early in the morning, called his servants, and told all these things in their hearing, and the men were very much afraid. And Abimelech called Abraham and said, What have you done to us? How have I offended you, that you have brought on me and on my kingdom a great sin? You have done deeds to me that ought not to be done. And then Abimelech said to Abraham, what did you have in view that you have done this thing? In other words, what were you thinking? What were you thinking that you would do this to me? Why would you lie like this? And I don't know if you've ever done things that should not have ever been done. Crazy things in your life. And yet, I love that the Bible shows us who Abraham is and what he is capable of. Because in our lives, we do things, hopefully not too often, but we have done things that ought not to be done, right? It's interesting because, in fact, a guy in our church was talking to this guy who belonged to a cult, and just the other day. And the guy was saying to him, talking about grace, and the guy, was all about works. And of course, the guy from our church said, hey, Jesus saves us not because of what we do, but because of His grace, because Jesus died for us. And my salvation is based completely on what Jesus did. And so the guy says, so you can just go out and kill people, and God will forgive you? And that's what they always say, isn't it? I mean, they always say that. Well, you just go out and sin all you want, right? Now, it's interesting that the Bible does actually kind of predict this. In fact, in Romans chapter 6 and chapter 7, he says, where sin abounded, grace, or chapter 5 rather, where sin abounded, grace abounded much more, right? And so, Paul, knowing that that's true, yes, you could go out and kill people. You could get saved one day and then go out the next day and kill people. And God would forgive you if you repented of it, right? I mean, if you confessed it as sin and said, the reality is yeah, you could go out and do anything, and you are capable of that. You realize that? And yet God's grace is big enough for that. And yet what does Paul say? Anticipating the stupidity of people, because he knows that most Christians who get saved are never going to kill anybody. In fact, probably because of their salvation, maybe they were going to kill somebody and they decided, I'm not going to kill people now because I love Jesus now. And that's usually the case. But every once in a while, like David, you go off the rails, like Abraham here, you go off the rails and you do something really stupid. Something you regret, something that you wish you never would have done, something you go to prison for the rest of your life. But is there grace enough for that? He says, that grace would abound in our sin. And yet, he anticipating it, he says, should we sin that grace should abound? Should we sin so that more grace can abound? He said, God forbid. How can we who died to sin live any longer in it? Right? And so as Christians, if we are in relationship with God and He writes His law upon our hearts and our minds, it's unlikely that we're just going to say, okay, now I'm a Christian, I can sin all I want, right? Usually the response of somebody becoming a Christian is, I'm a Christian, man, I just want to get rid of this stupid sin. And that's usually our heart. That doesn't mean you'll never kill anybody. Hopefully you won't. I'm pretty sure probably none of us ever will. But I've seen people do a lot of things that they shouldn't do as Christians. And yet even in that, God's grace is enough to forgive them when they'll come to Him and confess their sin. So two sides to that coin, and here's Abraham doing something very stupid. And Abimelech, he's being rebuked by a pagan king. This pagan king is saying, what in the world were you thinking, you idiot? You could have got me killed. You could have got my whole household killed. A righteous nation, right? Yeah, right. That's what he called himself. It's interesting because I'm sure Abimelech was probably woken up to the reality of God and the severity of God because his neighbor in Sodom and Gomorrah just got torched. And so the judgment of God might be very real in his mind at this moment. It says, verse 11, and Abraham said, because I thought, you're going to love Abraham's excuses. These are great excuses. Just think about these next time you need to give excuses for something stupid you do. And Abraham said, because I thought, surely the fear of God is not in this place, and they will kill me on the account of my wife. Okay, this is a lapse of reason for Abraham. Now, I understand Abraham just saw Sodom and Gomorrah go up in smoke. Maybe God's not with me anymore. But God made Abraham a bunch of promises, didn't He? So is Abraham's wife going to get killed? Is he going to get killed? No, because God made promises to him, to the contrary to that. But he's saying, hey, I thought because there's no fear of God here, there is now, but he thought because they didn't know God, you'd just kill me. But indeed, she is truly my sister. Oh, that's better then, right? She is my sister. She is the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother. So she's his half-sister. And she became my wife. Oh, this one day I woke up and there she was. She was my wife, I guess. I didn't know. No, he knew. And it's a half lie, but it's a full lie, right? Even though she was his half-sister. Okay, that's creepy, right? Think about marrying your half-brother or your half-sister. Because that'd be weird. Kissing cousins, that's a little bit worse than that. Why did Abraham marry his half-sister? How was this even okay? And this is in the line of Christ. Okay, think of this. Cain married, and Seth, probably, very likely married their full sister. Creepy? Isn't that weird? Can you imagine marrying your brother? Be weird, huh? Okay, so why? Why was incest okay back then and isn't okay now? Simple fact is, there's a law in thermodynamics called entropy. Second law of thermodynamics is that things go from a state of order to a state of chaos. Things start out good, they decay, right? You guys have noticed this. Just don't clean your house for a week. See what happens. Don't drive your car. It's amazing. We have a van out here. We didn't drive it very much. 4-year-old tires rotted and blew up because they didn't get driven enough. It's crazy. Just that's what happens when things aren't maintained. They fall apart. And you see that. Just travel the world and look at ruins of cities. Entire civilizations completely in dust because of entropy. And the same thing with the human genome. When God created us, our genome was perfect. Adam and Eve had perfect, complete genomes. They had kids, their kids had kids, their kids had kids, and probably for 100 generations there was no errors or hardly any errors in the genome. You could marry your sister. There was enough complexity within your DNA to have a viable offspring, and there was no problem. The problem is that there are 3 errors in your DNA every day. 3 errors happen within DNA every day in your body. And that's minuscule compared to the size of the computer code that's in you, the genetic code that's in you. But when you have a child, that child is less viable than you are. Now, it could be, by chance, more viable than you if your spouse is more viable than you. Meaning that their DNA is cleaner, stronger. But we worry about these things, don't we? You guys heard of what they call family history? You want to know about your family history? Why? Because you could have heart disease. All the people in my family died at 50. I'm probably going to die at 50, right? And that's the kind of stuff we think about. We think about our families because we have been passed DNA from them, which is going to affect the longevity of our life, the health problems that we have, all those things. Now, sometimes those things can be bred out if you marry somebody that's different enough from you because the genetic code is self-error correcting. And so when you marry somebody that's dissimilar to you, it can correct the DNA code sometimes. Sometimes you can pass something on to your kids from one of you, and that's possible. But back then, no problem. Until the law, they were able to marry brothers and sisters. And there wasn't anything culturally or ethically wrong with that. But God knew, okay, things are going to start getting weak. Stop marrying your brothers and your sisters. And so he gave that to us in his law. He knew that that was going to happen. I guess because he's God, right? And so he passed that on. So he can marry his half-sister and be okay, even though it's creepy that he would still call her his sister. So he says, she is my sister, the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. And it came to pass, when God caused me to wander from my father's house, that I said to her, this is your kindness that you shall do for me in every place, Wherever you go, say of me, he is my brother. Now this is kind of sad, because what Abraham is saying, and we don't see it in the English so much, but in the Hebrew, this word wander is never a good thing. It's almost as though he's accusing God. The word is used for a staggering drunk, to wander aimlessly with no direction and to stumble. That's basically what he is saying. And so you kind of sense maybe still a little bit of anger towards God in this. God send me out aimlessly is kind of what he's saying. When God caused me to wander from my father's house. It's like, when I was back at my father's house, things were good, but now I'm wandering aimlessly, staggering through life, and I knew that it was going to be dangerous, and so I had to protect myself. And so I said, whenever we're in a strange place, do this kindness for me to protect me from danger. In every place, wherever we go, say that he is my brother. Now, how would you like that, ladies, if, just think about that. Your husband says, just tell him you're my sister. Knock him out, right? Such a weird thing. And so he says, he gives 3 really lame excuses. I didn't think you feared God. She is my half-sister. And I told her this so that nobody would kill me. Real lame. I mean, you can't imagine a better or worse excuse. And Abraham should have just said, forgive me, Abimelech, for dishonoring both you, my wife, my God. My selfish cowardice overwhelmed me, and I just couldn't handle myself, and I was so afraid that I did the stupid, cowardly thing. He didn't do that. He just made his stupid excuses. Pretty sad. So, verse 14, it says, Then Abimelech took sheep, oxen, male and female servants, and gave them to Abraham. And he restored Sarah, his wife, to him. And Abimelech said, See, my land is before you, dwell where it pleases you. Then to Sarah he said, Behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. Indeed, this vindicates you before all who are with you and before everybody. Thus she was reproved or rebuked. So Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, his wife, and his female servants. Then they bore children, for the Lord had closed up the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. And so God, he sees this whole scene. He rebukes Abimelech. He tells Abimelech, you ask him to pray for you, and you'll be healed. That's the crazy thing about this. So what seems to have happened is, as God put this curse in, we don't know how long she was in his harem, this Abimelech's harem, where she was away from him, but we know it had to have been a sustained amount of time. We know it's less than probably 3 or 4 months, because remember, God told him in a year you're going to have a baby, so we need 9 months in there. Or I guess it'd be 3 months. You need 9 months in there at least for Sarah to get pregnant and for the baby to be born. And so it could be for a couple of months that she's in his harem, and during that time it would seem very possibly that all the women miscarried and nobody was able to get pregnant. And so it was long enough to where they were kind of aware, wait a minute, something's wrong here. And then when he restored Sarah back, Abraham prayed for him. Now this is why he is so generous to Abraham, because he believes, God has brought this curse upon him, and he believes, okay, I need to be more noble to this guy than he was to me, so that he'll pray for me and this curse will be lifted from us. And that seems to be what has happened. Abraham prays for him, and everyone is restored. And, in a sense, it's like Romans chapter 12, verse 20. What Abimelech is doing here is, when it says in Romans 12, it says, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink. For in doing so, you'll heap coals of fire upon his head, right? And the idea is if somebody is evil to you and mean to you and does you wrong, and you do good to them in response to that, they don't feel vindicated, right? They don't feel, just think about this. Okay, there's some couples in here. If your spouse or your boyfriend does something mean to you, and you do something mean back, don't they feel like, good, I'm glad I did something mean to you because you're just mean, right? But if you are nice to them in response to meanness, how do you feel then? If you're really a jerk and then your girlfriend, boyfriend, spouse is like, oh, that's okay, I understand you're having a rough day, and they're really nice to you in response to your meanness, you feel like a jerk, don't you? Because I was hoping that they would just be mean back, because then I could feel justified in my meanness. But when somebody does something nice, when they repay evil with good, now all of a sudden the scales aren't balanced, and you feel mean, you feel awful, and so then you hopefully repent. And that's the idea. When you do good to somebody who is mean to you, God will put it on them. Hey, you're mean to that person. They did something nice for you. There was a lady in our church. A guy was telling me that his wife, she was like, oh, I just can't believe what that person did to me. She was kind of complaining about something somebody had done to her, and she's like, oh, I'm just going to bake him a cake. Or a pie or something like that. And so she bakes this pie, as vindication. I'm going to go take this pie to this person who did me wrong. But that's the way that we should handle it. And that's what Abimelech does here. And he basically brings it on Abraham, and Abraham feels justified. But I love this part here, just to look back. Behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. Indeed, this vindicates you before all those who are with you, before everyone. Thus she was reproved. Isn't that interesting? I have given your brother, not your husband. I've given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. Pretty amazing story, and I don't think we have time tonight to get into the next chapter, chapter 21. And so what we'll do is we will do question and answer. And so we can do any questions about anything that you want to ask questions about, or what we talked about tonight. Actually, we'll pray first, and then we'll do that.